Alexander himself with his army was advancing towards the Ephesus. This was the time when Alexander obtained information about the Ganges and the strength of the army kept by Agrames, king of the Persians. He was the last ruler of the Nanda Empire whose capital was at Magadha. So, Alexander made a speech to his soldiers to induce them to advance to the Ganges. On behalf of Macedonian army, Coenus made a speech for returning back to home, much to Alexander's disappointment. Alexander was forced to turn back by his exhausted army, who refused to journey further into India fearing future hardships. The army had been exhausted due to years of journeys, fatigue, heat, diseases, cold weather, wild beasts, and lack of supplies. They miss their families, relatives and friends now. Alexander erects altars on the banks of the Ephesus. We are told that Alexander built altars on the banks of the Ephesus, Bs, to mark the limits of his advance, recrossed the Hydrotes, Ravi, and Achaeans, Chenab, and regained the Hydaspes, Jalem. Arrian writes, "Then they shouted, as a mixed multitude would shout when rejoicing, and many of them shed tears. Some of them even approached the royal pavilion, and invoked many blessings on Alexander, because by them and them only he permit himself to be vanquished." He then divided the army into brigades, which he ordered to prepare 12 altars to equal in height the highest military towers, and to exceed them in point of breadth, to serve as thank offerings to the gods who had led him so far as a conqueror, and also as a memorial of his own labors. When the altars had been constructed, he offered sacrifice upon them with the customary rites, and celebrated a gymnastic and equestrian contest. Having thereafter committed all the country west of the river Ephesus to the government of Poros, he marched back to the Hydrotes. Describing Alexander's altars on Ephesus River, Philostratus, d. 240 AD, writes in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, chapter 43. And having crossed the river Hydrotes and passed by several tribes, they reached the Ephesus, and 30 stades away from this they came on altars bearing this inscription: to Father Ammon and Heracles his brother, and to Athena Providence, and to Zeus of Olympus, and to the Cabiri of Samothrace, and to the Indian sun, and to the Delphian Apollo. We are told that a brass column was also erected, and inscribed. Alexander stayed his steps at this point. The Achaeans, where Alexander's general Coenus died. Coenus was one of the ablest and most faithful generals of Alexander in his eastern expedition. And he was the first who had the boldness strongly to urge the necessity of returning. The king was obliged to follow his advice. But a short time afterwards, when the Macedonian army had actually started its return, Coenus died of an illness in summer 326 BC. Alexander honored him a splendid burial. He lamented his death. Some believe that Coenus was poisoned due to his opposition to Alexander. Arrian in chapter 2, description of the voyage down the Hydaspes, notes, "At this time Coenus, who was one of Alexander's faithful companions, took ill and died, and his master buried him with all the magnificent circumstances allowed. He then assembled the companions and all the ambassadors of the Indians who had come to him, and in their presence appointed Poros king of all the Indian territories already subjugated, 7 nations in all, containing more than 2,000 cities. Alexander invades the territories of the Maloi and their strongholds. Alexander divided his army in 3 divisions. Crateros must have commanded a division of the infantry and cavalry along the right bank of the Hydaspes, Jalem, through today's Sind Sagar Thal, which lies in district Dera Ghazi Khan. Meanwhile, Hephaestion on the opposite bank advanced in command of the largest and best division of the army, to which the elephants, now 200 in number, were attached. These generals were instructed by Alexander to march with all possible speed to reach the palace of Sophites. King Sophites, his beauty, stature and hospitality. After the submission of the Adresti and Cathians, Alexander entered the kingdom of Sophites or Saubhatu. Arrian writes that his dominions lay along the banks of the Hydaspes River. Strabo believes his territory was the salt range called Oromenus by Pliny. Sophites voluntarily surrendered to Alexander. Arrian calls him Sophites, while Curtius calls him Sophitus. Some coins found bear his name in Greek letters as Sophites. According to the Cambridge History of India, Volume 4, 1968. The first Indian king whose name occurs on a coin is Sophites, Sabuti, a contemporary of Alexander. In later days, he struck coins with his name in Greek as Sophites. These coins depict the head of a warrior, wearing close-fitting helmet, wreathed with olive, a border of dots, caduceus and border of dots. According to Cunningham, the capital city of King Sophites must have been Old Burra, district Sargata, which was 3 days' march from Nicaea. Alexander reached here with his fleet after 3 days. Quintus Curtius Rufus writes that King Sophites along with his 2 grown-up sons issued from his capital to welcome Alexander. He was distinguished by his tall and handsome figure. His royal robe was adorned with pearls. His sandals were of gold and decorated with precious stones. It is considered that Alexander's forces sailed down jointly from Burra towards Multan. P.H.L. Egremont has briefly discussed the palace of King Sophites in his book entitled Alexander's Campaign in Southern Punjab, 1993. King Sophites entertained Alexander with splendor. The strength and tenacity of his great hunting dogs, of which he gave an exhibition, was what impressed the Europeans more than anything else. In short, King Sophites received Alexander with great hospitality and showed him a dog and lion fight in his capital city. Philippos, the satrap of Bactrians, received orders to follow Alexander. The command of the whole naval squadron was entrusted to Nearchos, while the pilot of Alexander's own ship was one Sekretos. There were a total number of 2,000 galleys, crafts and boats. Alexander sacrificed to the gods and to the river Acazines, Chenab, as the seers had directed. The voyage started with the sound of the trumpet. When the Indians who had submitted to Alexander heard the shouts of the rowers, they ran down to the edge of the river and followed the fleet, singing their wild, native chants. Now, Alexander reached the turbulent confluence of the Hydaspes, Jalem, and Acazines, Chenab. Many of the ships were damaged and sunk during this voyage. Meanwhile, Alexander made himself an inroad into the territories of the barbarians who refused to submit. These barbarians were probably the Siboi, Sibai or Sibi tribesmen. Submission of the Siboi, Agalassians, Maloi and Oxydrachi tribes. After crossing from Bucephalus, Nicaea and Burra, Alexander passed through modern-day Kot Kamalia, Tulamba, Atari and Multan. During this campaign he invaded the Siboi and Agalassian tribes. Describing Alexander's campaign in the Sibai, Quintus Curtius Rufus writes, "Thus he came at length into the country where the river Hydaspes falls into Acazines and thence flows down to the territories of the Sibi." According to the geography of Strabo, Alexander saw crocodiles in the Hydaspes, Jalem, and the Acazines, Chenab. He thought that he had discovered the source of the Nile River, and was about to equip a fleet with the intention of sailing by this river to Egypt. Alexander attacked Siboi. Nearly 40,000 foot soldiers had come up along the river to oppose Alexander's landing. He took their capital town by an assault. All people were compelled to surrender. Those who were of military age were put to the sword, and the rest were sold as slaves. Alexander then took another town, but the defenders resisted gallantly. Many of the Macedonians were killed. Alexander trapped the inhabitants, but they, despairing of safety, set fire to their houses, and cast themselves along with their wives and children into the flames. Now, Alexander came into the dominions of the Sudrasi and Mali, who were at war with each other. They united together in presence of the common danger. Their army consisted of 90,000 foot soldiers, together with 10,000 cavalry and 900 war chariots. They had selected their head from the Sudrasi nation. This experienced general encamped at the foot of mountain. He also ordered his army to kindle fires to terrify Macedonians. Alexander wounded by an Indian arrow. Alexander attacked the Sudrasi capital with force, but his soothsayer Demophan warned him not to undertake the siege and postpone it for a while, because omens had indicated that his life would be in danger. Nevertheless, Alexander ordered the scaling ladders to be applied to the walls. While others were hesitating to mount them, he himself scaled the ramparts. The Indians were shooting arrows from all directions towards Alexander, who was clinging to the edge of a rampart with his sword and shield. Alexander was severely wounded by a 2-cubit-long arrow shot by a defending archer. The archer ran forward to kill Alexander, but suddenly there came Pestas for his help. As Alexander bled badly, and he was exhausted, so he fell over on his shield. He was about to die from that arrow wound. Then came up Timaeus, Leonidas and Aristonus to save their king. All the Indians now ran in crowds to attack the king and his soldiers. In the meantime, a rumor spread that the king had fallen. Seeing this, the Macedonians broke down the wall with their pickaxes and rushed into the city. They did not spare old men, women and children. Alexander was taken into a tent where the surgeons had cut off the wooden shaft of the arrow which had pierced him, taking care not to stir its point. Critobulus, who was famous for his surgical work, extracted the arrow from Alexander's body. Everyone thought that Alexander was dying, so they started lamentations. The bleeding at last stopped and Alexander recovered from the wound. Today, the descendants of these Malay people are called Mali. They live in Multan and Laya regions. One day, an embassy from the Sudra Sea in Mali arrived to submit, with 150 powerful leaders for a treaty. Alexander selected the 1,000 best and tallest men from the Indians together with 500 chariots. He appointed Filippo as satrap of the Sudra Sea and Mali nations. Later on, he sent back hostages but he kept the chariots. Alexander entertained his army and the embassy at a sumptuous banquet. This was the time when a revolt arose in Bactria. Alexander resolved the affair of Bidon and Baucis of Margiana. Now, Perdiccas came to Alexander with his force after subjugating the Abastinoi, Sambastai, tribe. There he also received the submission of the Zathroi, Khatri, and Ossidioi Indian tribes. At this time, Oxyartes, the father of Alexander's Bactrian wife Roxana, arrived. Alexander bestowed him the satrapy of Peripamisidae. He also appointed Oxyartes and Python satraps of the country from the Acasians and Indus to the sea, together with the whole seaboard of India. Alexander also subjugated the Sodre, Masani, Abastanes and the Exithri tribes. He must have crossed from the modern districts of Jhelum, Chakwal, Mianwali, Kushab, Daragazi Khan, Bakar, Laya, Katadu, Muzaffargarh, and Rajanpur. It is told that a Magzi woman from village Nawakat, Tehsil Jabara, district Laya found a treasure trove of Indo-Greek coins from the desert in 1985. Foundation of Alexandria at the junction of Acasians and Indus rivers. According to Arrian, in 325 BC Alexander ordered Philippos to found a city there just at the meeting of the two rivers, i.e. the Acasians, modern Chenab, and the Indus rivers, and dockyards to be built. It was initially populated by 10,000 settlers. The existence of this settlement has been questioned. Assuming it was built, we do not know the exact location. This newly built city was also called Alexandria of Sogdoi. Alexander built new ship stations, and refitted his damaged ships here. Sir Alexander Cunningham and Egremont suggested that the settlement was located at Uch in southern Punjab. Therefore the town of Sogdia was identical with Alexandria Uch, which is 112 kilometers in the south-southeast of Multan.